everyone, Kara here, and welcome back to another episode of the Cultures for Health podcast. Cultures for Health wants to help you with your health goals for 2022. Visit culturesforhealth.com for 25% off when you use the code CFHpodcast. Today we are speaking with Amanda, who some of you might know from Instagram as the Gut Health Nutritionist, and is going to talk to us today about the Mindful Gut Framework and how to apply it to our everyday lives. Let's get started. Amanda, can you start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your history and how you got into gut health and how you tied that into fermentation and all of that?
Yeah. So hi everybody. My name's Amanda, and like Kara said, my Instagram handle is at guthealth.nutritionist. And gut health honestly was not the first thing. Like when I became a dietitian, that was never like on my radar, to be quite honest with you. It all really started with my love for food. That's how I decided to become a dietitian. I was like, I love eating. I love talking about food. Like, I didn't know there was a job that I could get paid to do that. And that's literally how I kind of decided to become a registered dietitian. So I went that route, and gut health came later. Gut health kind of, or like my interest in gut health came after, working a little bit in the field and kind of talking. The more you work, the more you talk to people, and the more you realize, or the more I realized, how many people, had digestion concerns or digestion issues, but no one really talks about it. It's kind of like, now maybe not so much. I feel like we're breaking down a lot more barriers, especially with social media, but then it was still a little kind of weird to talk about. So I also had like family members who, had some gut issues. I had a little bit of my own, and that kind of sparked my interest in getting more involved with gut health. And I even remember like in one of my classes, I think my only, introduction to it was like prebiotic and probiotics, and that was kind of the extent. So a lot of my training with gut health came after I became a dietitian and did more specialized work. So it's kind of the short of how I got here.
That's pretty cool. How long have you been a dietitian?
Oh my God. Okay, so I think I'm on my second cycle for CUs. So we have to do continuing education.
Right.
And it's every 5 years, I think. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. So we have to do, a certain amount of continuing education. And I think our cycles are like 5 years. And I think I'm going to be finishing out my second one. So I think I'm getting close to that, like 10 years. Oh my God.
That's awesome. So to all our listeners out there, listen up. We're getting a seasoned vet in today. That's awesome. That's really cool. So can you talk a little bit about the gut health framework meal plan and about the recipes? When you look at them, like they really seem to be, normal everyday recipes. I looked at your video and I was looking at the recipes you were scrolling through, and I was like, wow, that's like, that's stuff that I make, that's stuff that everyday people make, recipes that you see all over the internet. How have you adapted these recipes, or do you feel that you need to adapt recipes, or is, in seeing it, I was like, wow, okay, so people are eating more fermentation than they think they are, or did you find that you had to do like one or two little ingredient change and it kind of gave that gut health boost? Can you talk about that framework and how you developed it and how you got those recipes to where they are?
Sure. So, like I was saying, gut health came later. So one of my first kind of introductions into the world of nutrition was like mindful and intuitive eating. So that has always kind of been my home base, and that has helped me I've taken that, mindful and intuitive piece and have translated it into gut health, because the more I kept working with people, the more I realized how unique everybody's gut is. Like no one's gut is going to be the same person to person. Like that's just not a reality. What gut friendly foods are to me might not be the same to you, and vice versa. And so that's where I really started to realize how much mindfulness can play a role with gut health. And that's kind of how the mindful gut came about. And so it's built on 5 different principles. So this framework is built on 5 different principles that you can use to figure out what gut friendly means for you in regards to food and in regards to your lifestyle, right? Because gut isn't just about food. It's also about like how we live. So the first thing that is part of this framework is trust in your gut. That's the first principle. The second, there's really like no specific order, but these are just in the order of
Right.
saying now. Trust in your gut is the first one. Rest and recharge, because stress can play a huge role, right, with our gut and how we
Right.
feel. The third thing is kitchen confidence, and this is like probably my most favorite part of it. And we can talk about that, especially as it relates to like fermented foods. The fourth thing that is part of it is eating with intention. And then the fifth thing is purpose over perfection. So, really realizing that it's digging into your why, it's digging into your purpose, and knowing that there's no such thing as perfect gut. And it's really about progress versus, intentional progress versus some unattainable picture we might have in our head. So that is kind of how I came about the mindful gut, developed these 5 principles that anybody can use to figure out, again, like what works for them and what might not work for them, and find their gut friendly life. And then the recipes really dig into that kitchen confidence piece, because that's kind of like the glue that keeps everything together, I think. It's one thing to talk about like, oh, eat probiotics, eat fermented foods, eat fiber, eat blah, blah, blah. But how do I do that? What does that look like in my life? And I think that's where the kitchen confidence comes in, and pulls all of these things together into a very actionable way.
So when you're building these plans in this framework, you're not
Yeah.
just looking at fermented food, you're looking at things that have good fiber. I think I saw a note on
Mm-hmm.
your website about different colors and different nutrients. So it's
Oh,
not
yeah.
like
Mm-hmm.
fermentation can, I think fermentation can play a big part, but it's also important to practice the 5 things you just mentioned, but also
Yeah.
diet diversity, right?
Oh, yeah, that's huge. The diet diversity and is, I think, one of the biggest things that we can do to improve our overall gut health, and probably one of the hardest things to do, is because we all get, stuck eating the same things because we're used to it, or
Mhm.
it's quick. We know how to prepare those foods. But yeah, diet diversity, looking at eating, different colored fruits and vegetables, eating different amounts, trying to pick something at the grocery store that's new, eating fermented foods, different fermented foods. Not just seem like, oh, I'm just eating sauerkraut every day for the rest of my life. But like, what else can we,
Right.
add in there? So yeah, diet diversity is probably the best thing that we can do for our gut.
So that was going to be my next question is, do you, could you explain a little bit of the difference of prebiotics, probiotics, how that relates to ferments, and if it makes
Mm-hmm.
sense? Like, I think you're right that some people are like, oh, fermentation, I can eat sauerkraut, and that covers my basis for fermentation, but maybe speak a little bit to
Yeah,
different ferments, even in the diversity that fermentation alone has, and how that ties into prebiotics, probiotics, and how all of that ties into gut health.
sure. So this is a really popular question, and honestly, when I first was introduced into pre and probiotics way back in the day, I thought there was a typo, and I thought it was the same thing. I was like,
Same.
it looks the same
Yeah.
word. Like they just swapped the E for the O. Like what's happening here?
Mhm.
So pre and probiotics are 2 different things. I now know this. And prebiotics. So let's start with prebiotics. So prebiotics are like food for your gut bacteria. So we all have this, bacteria that lives in our gut, and prebiotics are a special. Usually fibers is where we mostly find them. Although there's other, sources being researched as a possible prebiotic, like polyphenols. But usually we see fibers. So usually there are specific fibers that will be food for your gut bacteria. So it's feeding that gut bacteria, which is great. We want that, right? Now, probiotics are different. They're not actually food. They are going to be some type of bacteria that is giving your body some type of health benefit. So fermented foods, where fermented foods falls into play, is fermented foods can be a source of probiotics. We can find some live bacteria in fermented foods. Not all fermented foods, but quite a few fermented foods. Or you can get a probiotic, as a supplement. So you could look either towards fermented foods, or you can look towards supplements to get a source of probiotics. With prebiotics, you're mostly looking, like, honestly, it's not something super intuitive. But like oats would be an example of, a prebiotic food, asparagus, garlic, onions. But really, I emphasize just, again, that variety of fiber is going to be really helpful for the prebiotics. But going back to the probiotics, so yeah, fermented foods are going to be your food source of a probiotic. So things like yogurt, things like sauerkraut are going to fall under here. What's interesting, kind of hitting on the question you're asking, is yeah, you could say like, oh, I'm eating sauerkraut, so I'm getting, my probiotics. But different food sources, depending on whatever you're fermenting, are going to have different types of, bacteria living in there. So what you find in sauerkraut, you're not going to find in, yogurt or kefir or tempeh. So that's why not only do you want to get variety with whatever, fruits, veggies, proteins, and all that, but getting a variety of whatever ferments you have is also going to be helpful, because you're going to get different strains of that probiotic.
Right. So you kind of just made me think of this, but tying in with that, I think a growing trend that I'm seeing with our customer service questions is people will ask about a specific strain of bacteria and say like, hey, does your vegan yogurt contain this strain, or does your Greek yogurt contain this strain? Do you find that that's becoming more popular, and that that's really like, should that be the question we're asking, is should we be doing research on specific strains and finding ferments that carry certain bacteria strains that are supposed to have certain health effects? Could you maybe talk on the science about that a little bit, and whether that's something that you tend to follow, or if you think that's maybe a little bit overkill?
I don't think it's overkill. Yes, I think it's overkill if we get overly concerned about like, oh, it has to be this specific type of strain. Because this is what we have documented as a health benefit, right? Based off of the strain. I think the thing with research is that it's ever evolving, especially when it comes to the world of like fermented foods and probiotics and gut health, that I think there's things that aren't yet documented that will be sometime, in the future. We're just not there yet. So I think it's good to start becoming aware of like, oh, that it's the strains that really are the things we need to, be looking at. But don't discount a food just because we don't necessarily have research yet to document that specific health, benefit based off of whatever that ferment is. I still think it's really important to get that variety, even though the science might not quite be there to back it up yet. Does that kind of like help answer your question? But I think just really,
absolutely.
Yeah, variety.
Yeah, I think that's one of the amazing things about fermentation, is that it's thousands and thousands of years old, but the science is starting now.
Yeah.
All of the things that we're discovering about it. And I'm sure you see that as a dietitian more than I do as someone who just makes scobies. But the actual, some would call it a pseudoscience, because the science isn't really there. Like we know it helps, but we don't know what each individual strain is. And so it's interesting to hear your perspective on that, because I think sometimes people could get too tied into the science, where it's like fermentation in general is really good for you. So even if we don't offer a product that has a specific strain that you're looking for, me recommending, like you were looking for a Greek yogurt that has this strain, but we can't guarantee that because we don't strain test our yogurts, but it's still a good product. It's still a good ferment. It's still providing you with the good gut health things. So it's the science is really interesting, and it's really interesting to follow it as it comes out and see how people are reacting and adjusting their diets. And I guess that's really, I don't know, you can speak for yourself, but I'm sure that's a lot of your work, is reading these articles and readjusting and figuring it out and helping. I'm sure, yeah.
It's sometimes, to be quite honest with everybody. I obviously read a lot of different things, but at the end, there's always that caveat, like more research is needed. So, I try to go back to what can we do now, right? Where we might not be there yet, but like you said, just because we can't necessarily document that that specific Greek yogurt has this specific strain doesn't discount that this food isn't good for you, doesn't offer other health benefits. Um, so yeah, even there's still, a lot of consensus to be made about what strains, do specific things. And it's, yeah, it's fascinating, but at the same time, it's like, frustrating.
Overwhelming. Yeah,
Yeah,
for
overwhelming.
sure.
That's a good word to describe it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I guess going into that,
Mm-hmm.
I think you mentioned a little bit of like variety is a thing,
Yeah.
it's a big deal. Um, What is your advice to people who are looking to incorporate gut health, fermentation, all of everything you've
Mm-hmm.
kind of already touched on? What is your advice to the people who are starting out who may have never
Mm.
eaten a fermented food or
Yeah.
don't know about color and variety of nutrients and want to
Mm-hmm.
expand but like their comfort zone? How do you
Yeah.
how do you get people there? How do you get people to
So there's so many ways. Yeah. Okay,
right,
so I'm
of course.
like filtering through like my Rolodex. Oh my God, or my like thing of like, okay, what I do. So
Mhm.
I think one of the easiest ways to do it is, yeah, emphasizing different colors. Like just pick up a different colored fruit, vegetable thing, but come in with a game plan. Like, okay, if I'm gonna pick up this bok choy, I don't know why I said bok choy. Maybe I want bok choy. I have already an idea of how I'm going to make it. Kind of like when you're
Mhm.
buying clothes at the store and you see a shirt and you're like, I already know how I would wear this or what jeans I would wear it with. That's what you want
Right.
to feel like when you go to the store and you pick up something new. Don't just pick it up and have no idea what you're going to do with it. You could, it'll
Mhm.
be a gamble, but
Right.
if you have an idea of like, oh, I'm going to grill this and I saw a recipe and I know how I'm going to make it and I'm going to make it, because that starts to build like efficacy, like build confidence in yourself, right? So that
Mhm.
would be one easy way for people that are like, I need somewhere to start, have no idea where to start. That would be my first suggestion. Then if you're starting to like dip your toes into that other thing you mentioned of like, what if you've never had a fermented food? That was me. Like I didn't grow up, being exposed
Mhm.
to fermented. That wasn't just like, that wasn't, like a normal thing in our household, in our kitchen for, whatever reason, probably because they didn't grow up with it. Right.
Right.
So very similar to how you would have a game plan, I would also have an idea of like, okay, what's the one that sounds like something I could try? I think yogurt is usually a good place to start because there's so many things you can do with yogurt, right? Like you could throw it in a
Definitely.
smoothie, you could eat it by itself, you could add fruit, you
Mhm.
can make it into a dip. So I think that's probably where I would have a lot of people maybe start with. Um,
Mhm.
because you can also adjust the flavor. I remember the first time I had plain Greek
Right.
yogurt, I was not
Homemade
prepared.
yogurt. Yeah.
I was not prepared
Definitely.
for the tartness.
Yeah, I will definitely say I think that's one of the biggest differences we see of homemade and commercial fermented products is in yogurts. I think a homemade yogurt without the thickeners and the sweeteners is
Yeah.
always a surprise to our customers. I think
Hmm.
sometimes pleasant for some people, but sometimes also off-putting for
Just
some people
different.
as well. Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely different.
just different. And then the other thing that I would probably suggest is to start trying. Like if you feel, okay, I got this down, I'm trying different things, you have tried different foods, start dipping your toes into like making your own ferment.
Mhm.
I think the first ferment that I made was curtido, which is like an El Salvadorian, sauerkraut. Um, and it was
Mm.
just so easy. It was just so
Yeah,
easy. I'm like, I just
yeah.
got to
I
shred the
love
cabbage,
Curtido.
right? I
Yes.
just got to shred the
Awesome.
cabbage and chop, a chili and, do my thing and just let it sit on the counter, right? I think that's probably one of the easiest ferments people can start playing with. At least for me, it
Mhm.
was. Um, Kombucha I've not done, but that scares me a little bit because it's just, I feel like that's like another level of advancement and I'm not there yet.
Definitely. Kombucha is a commitment. Once you have it, it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's, those would be my suggestions is just start experimenting.
Mhm.
Oh, and my other suggestion, or I guess my advice would be to keep trying just because, maybe it didn't work out or for whatever reason, it didn't work out or you didn't like the taste, like try it again. That doesn't mean you don't like it forever and ever,
Mhm. And
Keeps it.
try it differently, right? Like
Yeah.
different fermentation
Yeah.
times, temperatures, different
Mhm.
ingredients are all gonna
Mhm.
interact differently. So if,
Yeah.
I always say
Yeah.
like if you make your Greek yogurt and it was too tart, try fermenting it for an hour less and it might be a little less
Mhm.
tart for you. So there's plenty that you can do to adapt
Yeah.
any foods, I would say really
Yeah. There's a lot
to
of
your
variables.
liking. Mhm.
Mhm.
Can you talk about kitchen confidence a little bit more? I feel like you've kind of touched it a little bit here and there, but talk
Yeah.
about how people can build confidence in the kitchen, not only in
Mhm.
fermenting for themselves, but also
Yeah.
cooking and introducing new foods into their diet. Because I think,
Yeah.
a lot of us, we've touched something like yogurt, but a lot of us are really afraid of sauerkraut. So how do we introduce new foods into our diet, new
Yeah.
ferments, and do
Mhm.
it in a way that's successful for us?
I think trying one thing at a time, is and it sounds like so simple, but it's so
Mhm.
powerful. Just trying one thing at a time, having an idea of how you're going to prepare it. Word of mouth, I think, is really helpful. So, like, asking your friends, like, if you have a friend who has made a food a certain way, or
Mhm.
you had a dish that they made and you really liked it, and it had whatever in there, asking them for the recipe. um I think that's a good way, like crowdsourcing people who you know and you trust. You're like, okay, I want to try it. What is your favorite way of doing it? I think it also just
Mhm.
brings in community, which is important for food.
Definitely.
Yeah, so I think that would be, a good place to start is crowdsourcing from your friends, from your family of how they make food. I think that's kind of how I got exposed to some foods too. I remember at one of my jobs that I had, we had this program where we would deliver a different fruit or vegetable into the classrooms each month. And
Oh, cool.
persimmons was it for 1 month, and I had never in my life had ever had a persimmon.
Mhm.
And I was like, this is the best fruit ever. Why have I never had this fruit? I love persimmons. And now I'm like, why are
Yeah.
persimmons so expensive? um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so I think that's like a good way is just kind of crowdsourcing from people. Um, go on YouTube and start looking at people making stuff, so that you can kind of visualize it. So if you're really like, oh man, I'm like bare bones, I
Mhm.
boil water and that's it. Just try watching people do things. I think that can help to build some confidence in yourself, and starting really simple.
Yeah, definitely. I can't tell you how many times I've just watched a food YouTube video because it was
Hmm.
interesting and I thought it might give me some inspiration. I think that's the great
Yeah.
thing about cooking shows, things
Hmm.
like Ugly Delicious, those kind of cooking
Hmm.
shows is they give other inspiration that you may not think of in your everyday spaghetti or something like that. So I think absolutely
Right.
if you look, it's out there.
Hmm.
Magazines, websites, YouTube videos, books. It's all out
Yeah,
there. You gotta take it for yourself. You gotta want it.
exactly. Yeah, just try
Yeah,
something.
but yeah, absolutely. And again, like if you don't like the way that you did it the first time, don't just say, "Oh, I didn't
Hmm.
like this food." Try cooking it. Like some people like fresh spinach, and some people like cooked spinach, and some people
Yeah.
like one and not the other. You just gotta adapt
Yeah,
it to the
prep it in
way
different
that
ways.
you like it.
Yeah, prep
Yeah,
in
for
different
sure.
ways, try it in different ways. Hmm.
For sure. So, with that, is there favorites that you have? Is there favorites that you want to talk about? Recipes that you've really liked that you
Mm.
found that have been
Yeah.
staples in your diet that you didn't necessarily
Uh-huh.
know about, or foods that you didn't try before you started on this
Yeah.
journey and now you're here 10
Mhm.
years later and you're like, these are great, these are my staples, like these are always my go-to's.
Uh, okay, let's start with persimmons just because it's also the season. Persimmons are like one of my go-tos in fall or winter or whatever. Um, Cortido has been like another kind of staple that I've been finding myself making more often just because it was like so easy and I really like it. And how I got exposed to that was when I went to the farmers market and I got pupusas,
Mhm.
and I was like, that was like my exposure. So just trying different foods, when I went and bought, prepped foods, so that was something. So I would say that. What else would I say were staples? Yogurt was never a staple growing up, and I feel like it's like a go-to for me now. I really enjoy yogurt as like a snack and smoothies and oats, whatever. I found so much versatility with that.
Mhm.
Um, I want to build up to doing yogurt in my Instant Pot. I keep seeing recipes. I keep seeing it out there. I'm like, okay, how can I want to start trying to do that. That's like what my next project for myself is to figure that out. I have a friend who makes it and she makes it look so easy. So I'm like, okay, I can do this. I can do this.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely
um,
can.
yeah. So I'm trying to think of some of the other. And then I think another thing too, which is kind of random, but not so much, is even when I go out to eat, because sometimes this is a way, especially if you're not used to cooking a lot of different things, I try to get a different like side dish or try a different dish I've never had before and see
Mhm.
how they've prepped it and see if I like it. So even like finding variety in like wherever you go out to eat, I think can be kind of a safer way because usually, usually they're going to prep it pretty good. Yeah, I think that's like another strategy that I kind of unintentionally, or not unintentionally, like just don't even realize I do, but I do. Yeah.
That's cool. It sounds like you really have incorporated many different ferments and foods in general into your diet. And I absolutely agree that one of the best ways to try foods is to go somewhere and order something you
Yeah.
wouldn't usually order and
Right.
see if you like it that way. Because
Hmm.
the people who are trained to cook it are always going to cook it the best. So
Right.
if you like it when they cook
Exactly.
it, you'll got a
Hmm.
shot when you do it yourself. Can you so I'm going to
Hmm.
take a different step here. Can you tell
Yeah.
us about a time that cultured food, fermented food has
Hmm.
helped someone that you've worked with, someone who
Yeah.
you've given, the gut health framework to,
Hmm. Hmm.
and how it's benefited them, or just how you think it benefits people in general, or a little bit of both?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a little bit of both of those things. I've had people, try different cultured or fermented foods and either they tolerate it better than they would, you know, um, like what am I'm thinking of, oh my gosh, I can picture the little container in my head. Cottage cheese. There we go. Cultured like cottage cheese. I'm
Yes.
like, I can see the container in my head. Um, I've had people, tell me that they seem to tolerate it better when they've had, cultured foods like that. I've had people who had said like their gut just feels more settled and calmer when they've included fermented or cultured foods in their life. And the interesting piece about cultured and fermented foods is sometimes you don't always feel it, uh, but it
Mhm.
doesn't mean it's not doing anything. I want to
Right.
emphasize that because I'm like prevention is powerful. And right. So, like, including these things, if you don't feel like this, magical moment, doesn't mean it's
Mhm.
not doing anything in your body that is good for you. Um,
Right.
so just that overall, just that piece of knowing that I am actively eating something that is going to be extremely beneficial for my gut health, for my digestion. I think just that piece of knowing that is good too. And then when people start dipping their toes into making it starts building that kitchen confidence. I think that's can be another piece of it. Is like building that efficacy. Like I not only can I know how to make like maybe I can make this yogurt and dips or smoothies. I can now actually make the yogurt and feel good about doing that. And
Mhm.
now I'm saving money and I know exactly what's
Right.
going in there, right? I can control. So, especially if sometimes people have sensitivities to things or they want to adjust the
Mhm.
sugar or the sweetness level or the tartness level or whatever it happens to be, knowing that they can do that and make it on their own, is pretty powerful.
Have you, in the past, have you gotten reports that, oh, I felt
Hmm.
like I had more energy. I felt like it
Hmm.
like brightened my skin. You talked about how
Yeah.
you don't necessarily need to feel the physical symptoms
Yeah.
of fermentation to know
Yeah.
fermentation is working. What in the past have those symptoms, or I guess symptoms kind of has a negative
Like
connotation, but
physical.
yeah, but what are
Mm-hmm.
the attributes that you find that people feel when they are eating fermented foods? Or is it
Uh-huh.
really just like a we have to trust that it's working?
Not always just trust. I think there are people that have like physically felt different, either whether and I want to point out like everyone is different. This is not
Mhm.
like a guaranteed thing,
Oh,
right?
of
Like
course, right.
always like
Yeah,
to set the
definitely.
table.
Everyone is different. Yes.
um, but eat like less bloating. I've heard reports of that, feeling like less bloating. The one you mentioned about skin, also some clearer skin. Um,
Mhm.
and like better pooping is kind of like another one that I've
Mhm.
also heard of. I feel like those are the most popular things I've had people report. And again, like I don't know how to describe it, but just like that feeling of like settle, like it just feels like your stomach is settled. Um, yeah, that's like another kind of kind of physical way I think I've heard of when people have started incorporating it, the fermented or cultured foods into their diet.
So you've mentioned bloating and food sensitivities. How does fermentation and gut health and planning and all of these things that we've been talking about, how does that play into
Hmm.
intolerances and food sensitivities? I have someone related to me who has
Yeah.
IBS, and
Hmm.
when I found that out, I was like, what you can't eat, I'm going to try to ferment and then see if you can eat it. Like, that was my
Yeah.
reaction, was like, let
Yeah.
me ferment it for you, and if you're
Yeah.
willing to try it and like
Yeah.
willing to take that risk, I would love to see what
What
you
it
can
can do.
handle with
Hmm.
that product being fermented. Because with IBS and having to follow the
Hmm.
FODMAP diet and all of that,
Hmm.
it was something that, and like I have friends who have celiacs, and so
Hmm.
for me, my reaction is always like, oh, let me ferment it and see if the
I love that.
fermentation process is breaking down what your body isn't able to digest. So could you talk a
Yeah.
little bit about how it plays into
Hmm.
food sensitivities and tolerance, and how
Hmm.
like if you're lactose
Hmm.
intolerant, you can have cheese and yogurts. There's the 24-hour yogurt trend because people think that it ferments out all the
Hmm.
lactose and it makes it, easier
Yeah.
digestible and better
Yeah.
for our gut. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I love that. That's so cool to have a friend like, let me ferment something for you, right? Because the whole idea is like that fermenting helps increase
Mhm.
digestibility. So
Right.
if I can do this process to increase digestibility, then maybe you can tolerate it and still include it. Because the tricky part, especially with IBS, is you do find that you a lot of people do find that they have food sensitivities, and it can be really hard because it can feel like your diet is starting to dwindle in regards to variety, which is the one thing our gut really wants. But then you're like, I can't tolerate it, so how do I include the variety? So that it becomes really, difficult to navigate that for people. So doing that fermentation process can help increase the digestibility, but also with food sensitivities, I think the two biggest factors that you want to keep in mind, especially if you have IBS, is how much and how often. That's like a really, really, or those, I guess, let me rephrase that. Those are like the really big variables that come into play. So even if you do find yourself sensitive to things that might be higher in like FODMAPs, like garlic and onion, for example, playing around with how often you eat it. So like, okay, I'm not going to eat this every meal, or I'm going to eat this every other day. It's going to look different person to person. And then how much you eat of it. So like one time I had a client who went, I forgot what it was. I think it was like edamame. It was like garlic edamame. And she's like,
Mhm.
"Oh no, that was not that was not my friend." I was like, "I can do garlic, but I can't." But it was so good, so she kept eating it because it was really yummy. Um,
Right.
but that amount was definitely too much for her. But it was helpful knowing that she could still have the garlic, but just not just covered, with in the edamame or with the
Mhm.
edamame. So I think playing around with those two factors is how much and how often can be really powerful with food sensitivities. And then, yeah, experimenting with fermenting different things to help increase the digestibility to see if you tolerate it better. With like lactose, like you mentioned too, that's a really kind of popular one that sometimes people will have issues with it. Maybe it's not so much the milk, but it's like the lactose that they're not breaking down. Maybe they're intolerant or for whatever other reason that they have going on. So I think knowing that the fermentation is always an avenue for people to explore because it
Mhm.
can be really helpful knowing that I can try this and still include it in my diet so I still have more variety and not have to necessarily, give it up for forever and ever.
Do you think that it's all
Mhm.
trial and error to a degree,
Yeah.
and everyone is different, right? Like you were just saying,
Sure.
like some people can have
Hmm.
some amounts of garlic, some people can have
Yeah.
no garlic.
Hmm.
How is there a way to go about it safely, or do you need to
Hmm.
worry about going about it safely? With the person
Yeah.
that I know that has IBS, it's,
Yeah.
hey, I want you to try this, but then she'll come back to me and say, well, I got to work tomorrow and I can't risk doing
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
before a work day. So
Yeah.
do you have
Yeah.
advice or recommendations for people
Yeah.
to tread
Good
and play
question.
safely?
Hmm.
And is there what signs from our bodies can we listen to of, yes, this ferment
Hmm.
worked for me, no it
Yeah.
didn't, maybe I should try these cultured foods, maybe cultured
Yeah.
food. I don't know if you've ever run into anyone who's ever had just like a completed version to everything fermented, but how do we
Hmm.
listen to our bodies about whether or not
Yeah. That's a good
this
question.
these things are good for us,
Are
and they're
working.
yeah,
Hmm.
they're working, they're changing, they're helping us, we're actually
Hmm.
improving our gut health. And
Hmm.
because it's one thing to have a sensitivity, but you
Yeah.
don't want to irk that sensitivity
Yeah.
by, trying to not irk that sensitivity by
Yeah.
fermenting
No, I
that
get.
product. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
can you speak on that a little bit?
Sure. I think that a really good tool to use to help you to get to know your body, to help you find that and build that trust is a food journal, a food and mood journal specifically, because mood can definitely, like stress, um, can impact how your gut feels. Like even if your gut felt amazing, but you're gonna have a stressful day, like that's not a day to try something new, right? Because you already know that could impact it. So I think starting with a food and mood journal to build a baseline to just build your baseline of how food feels for you, how your mood impacts it. For example, let's say you're really busy while you're eating lunch and you wrote that down, like kind of, or maybe you weren't even stressed, but you were just eating really quickly because you were running around and you only had 10 minutes to eat before you had to go do something. And then you find yourself feeling maybe bloated or burping. Well, maybe it wasn't the food and maybe it was how you ate because of, the atmosphere you were in. So a food and mood journal will remember all of this for you because when you think back, our memory is tricky and you got more important things to remember, right? So
Mhm.
I think doing that food and mood journal will help you establish a baseline. And I do have a sample food and mood journal. I'll send you guys the link to kind of help you get an idea of what to record and how to record. So that's going to be a good place to start that you could start today, right? At any point. It doesn't cost you a dime to start, keeping a journal. And that journal can also be really helpful for you when you're experimenting and trying new foods. So a piece of advice is kind of like what your friend was saying, like, I can't try this because I'm going to work and I don't want to be in a place that, I don't want to be at work and not know how this is
Mhm.
going to, do for me. So making sure that when you try something and you're experimenting, really approach it from a place of neutrality. So pretend you're like a scientist. You're like, okay, is this working or is this not? Because sometimes we get super, not emotional is not the word I'm looking for, but super aware, I guess, where you're like, oh, it didn't work. Oh my God. It can be easier to like fall into like a negative, thought
Mhm.
process if it did or did it. So really kind of just pretend like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to try this and see how I feel. And when you do try food, try it when especially if it's a food you think it might be riskier, like food make you run to the bathroom. Try it in a place where you feel comfortable, that you have access to a bathroom. Try it when your stomach feels more settled, when your gut just feels more settled. Like, don't try it after you went to someone's holiday dinner and you had a bunch of food like you don't know, right?
Mhm.
So, try it when you're feeling really solid, and then have your food journal and write down how much you had, when you had it, what other foods you had that day. so that you can start to kind of build a pattern and see, okay, oh, when I had it, today and I didn't have it the next day, it seemed to tolerate it. Or, I can eat it today for dinner and I can have it for breakfast, but that's it. Starting to play around so at least you have a record to go back to, and it is kind of like a safer way to start building this. But if you're really, confused and you're really not sure, or if you feel like you just need more support, I think that's when, having a dietitian on your team can be really helpful to give you more of a, that expert lens with guidance. But I think that food and mood journal, even when you're working with a dietitian, is still going to be a good tool to use.
So that was actually going to be my next question was with a food and mood journal, how
Yeah.
do we analyze it for ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
What are patterns or things that we should look for when we're going
Mm-hmm.
back and rereading, and when do you find it useful? A lot of this can be a self-led journey, but when do you find it
Yeah.
useful to connect with someone like you who's been doing this
Mm-hmm.
for a while and
Mm-hmm.
can maybe analyze that food journal in a way that you might not be able to? Can you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
um,
So
we would
uh-huh.
approach that?
I'll start backwards. So if you're experiencing a lot of symptoms that are persistent and or with pain, I think that's like maybe a sign you want to explore further with the doctor, to rule out any like medical things, and then exploring that also with a dietitian. Also too, if you found like your diet is very limited, that could be another like flag or sign that there's definitely room to explore on your own, but I think that would be a good also sign to start exploring with a doctor dietitian, uh, doctor and dietitian. I always want to say like always go to doctor. Like we are not medical professionals, so always making sure you're ruling those things out. But doctors aren't going to give you the food stuff. That's when you go to the dietitian. So
Right.
if you have symptoms that are persistent and or with pain, and or you also have a very small diet because you keep finding yourself reacting to a lot of things, those would be some big signs that you want to have a dietitian. Okay, so that's that. But there's so much you can do on your own, like you said, like a self-guided journey. So when you're using your journal, it can be somewhat overwhelming to have all of this data, and you're like, okay, now what do I do with
Right.
this data? How do I decipher it? So one thing that I found is like picking, one or two goals that you have in mind, one or two things that you want to explore, and let that be at the forefront of your mind. So if you are trying to see, maybe when you're experiencing burping or bloating. I don't know why those are the two that keep popping in the head. But maybe you want to see when you're like feeling like bloated. Am I feeling
Right.
bloated consistently? When is this happening? So writing that down and then going back and highlighting it. So that can be more of an easier way to pick up a pattern is when you see a certain color, and that can be helpful. So just focusing on one thing or one food at a time, or two is like the max, I would say, so that you are able to kind of dive into your data with a plan and not feel overwhelmed with it all. Or maybe you want to see, how often you're pooping, and what that poop is looking like. Is it like a nice and healthy looking, or is it not? So maybe you start tracking that and using that as your marker for whatever your goals are. I think that can be a helpful way. And especially too, if you're trying new foods, when you're having food sensitivities and you're experimenting, making sure to like write it really big at the top of your journal, and then be pretty specific with how you prepped it, kind of like guesstimate the amount. I'm not saying you gotta walk around with like measuring
The
cups and
scale.
spoons, right? The
Yeah.
scale, right? But
Mhm.
you can at least kind of, you can even take a picture of it if you wanted, if that's easier, or kind of use your hands as a guide. Like, I think I had a palm full, or, whatever that happens to be. Um, and writing that down. So like, how you prepped it, how much you had, and then you maybe highlighting that so you can have more of a visual. So really just focusing on one or two things at a time. And if all of that seems overwhelming, just writing it down will build so much awareness on a subconscious level, it'll start to come to you. Honestly, just even the act of like, oh, I should write that down, even if you forget to write it down, will start to build some awareness, and you'll start picking up on things um, without even realizing it.
So, going in with that and the idea of picking one or two things, do you think,
Mm-hmm.
and I think you might have said this earlier, but do you think that it's important when trying new foods, introducing
Yeah.
fermented versions of something you might have an intolerance for? Do you think it's important to kind of almost isolate that as a new food and don't try 3 or 4 or 5 new foods at once, but
Yes.
try one so that
Yes.
way you know, like, these are all the things that my body's good with. These are all the things that are like my
Yes.
go-to standards. Let me
Yeah.
introduce this food so I can see what my body handles. Do you have any recommendations, advice on,
Just like you
I,
said.
yeah.
I think like when you're introducing foods to a baby, right? You don't hand a
Mhm.
baby like a taco. You do it one at a time, right? Because you want to see how they react and you want to see if everything's okay. It's the same here. So when you're introducing, a new food that you think you might have an issue with, don't introduce it in combination with other foods you're not sure about. Do it with foods that you know are going to work for you. So that day or the day before, stick with things that you know are solid, that are your friend, and then try that new food so that you're not coming in with like, was it the new food or was it this food that I had? Because I don't normally eat that, but I did that day. So just like you said, have that solid plan of like, okay, this is the foods that I know are gonna work with me, and I'm gonna eat these foods for the day. Try this new thing, so that if I don't feel great or if I do feel great, boom, I know like that it was that.
On the flip side of that, what are your
Hmm.
thoughts on the, I guess, elimination diet, which is my
Yeah.
understanding of it is when you have all of these reactions and all of these sensitivities and you don't really know where it's coming from.
Hmm.
How, what is your best advice to people figuring that out and figuring out whether they can handle the fermented version and
Yeah.
eliminating what they need to eliminate, but also being able to reincorporate. Like someone may figure out that cabbage causes them a lot of gas,
Yeah.
but they still like sauerkraut or
Hmm.
something like that. How do we eliminate and reintroduce things into our diet in a way that is sustainable and good for our gut microbes?
I think you really hit it on the point. The point that, yeah, elimination diets can be a great tool for people. They totally can. It's not the first tool I would suggest. Honestly, the journal is the first tool, but
Mhm.
elimination diets can be a tool in your toolbox to explore, to figure out if you're really trying to pinpoint, what food or foods might be an issue. The
Mhm.
most important thing about an elimination diet is it should be short. It shouldn't be a long period of time. If you're going to explore an elimination diet, ideally the best way would be do it with like a dietitian, so you have more of an
Okay.
expert guidance. In addition, elimination diets always need to include reintroduction. That is
Right.
so, so important, right? You're not just
Mhm.
eliminating and like, oh, great, now I feel better, but like now my
Now I'm
diet
fine.
is,
Yeah. Peas.
with like 5 foods. That's not the
Yeah.
goal. The goal is to
Right.
reintroduce, and you want to reintroduce foods one at a time. You want to do it slowly, and you can try it in different ways. Like you said with the cabbage, okay, I can try it raw. Most people are gonna have gas, like just straight up, like it's gonna be an issue for mostly everybody. Um, but if I ferment it and have a sauerkraut, okay, that's, pretty good. So reintroducing foods kind of one at a time, reintroducing foods with different preparation methods, like fermenting, or even just like simply cooking. Maybe I can't do this raw, but I tolerate a lot better when it's cooked because it softens the fiber. It just makes it easier to digest. Um, so, exploring different cooking methods or fermenting methods as well, just prep methods in general. But yeah, make sure you always reintroduce. And that's where that journal is also going to come in to help you, like, oh, this is when I reintroduce this food. This is when I reintroduce that food. And it'll help you start to, pick up patterns.
All really good advice. I've learned a little
Yeah.
bit today. Thank you so much for taking time. I
Yeah.
think you gave us a lot of great advice and a lot of things to think about. Is there any parting
Mm.
ideas, words of advice, recommendations, favorite ferments, any of those kinds of things that you'd like to share with us before we go?
If you're really dipping your toes, like sauerkraut curtido, I think is like so easy. I think that's like an easy way to start, and that's how I kind of started. Maybe that's why I'm such a fan of it. I think yogurt is so variable. I think really exploring that is a fun way to do it. Next time you go to the grocery store, pick up something new. Pick up something new, or start watching cooking shows, or a TikTok, or Instagram reel. Like there's so much information at your fingertips. Just watch something, see if it sounds good, and try picking it up the next time you go to start increasing, some more variability in your diet. And just experiment, have fun. There's no right or wrong. It's just what works for you.
Yeah, what she said. 100% agree. Thank you so much, Amanda, for coming on our podcast today and giving us a little more of the background and the science to why we do and eat ferments. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for coming and talking to us on the Cultures for Health podcast. To all of our listeners, please go check out her Instagram and her website to see what she's up to and for more advice and helpful tips. If you're looking to improve your gut health in the new year, Cultures for Health has all your probiotic needs for a happy and healthy gut. Visit culturesforhealth.com and get 25% off when you use the code CFH podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.